Recent months have seen several public instances of sexual harassment, instances that have led to spirited debates over root causes and the best way to change behavior. Joining us now for their insights on the matter, in the nation's capital, Julie Lalonde, public educator with the Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centres. Back here in Toronto, Oren Amate, psychologist who practices here in Toronto, Ann Kingston, senior writer with Maclean's Magazine, and Margaret Wente, columnist with the Globe and Mail, and we're happy to welcome everybody to the program today. Julie, I'm going to start with you in Ottawa because off the top of the program we did list several recent examples of sexual harassment, and I wonder if you think we are actually seeing more cases of this, or are we simply talking about it more?
I don't believe we're actually seeing an increase in sexual harassment right now. I mean, time will tell whether or not we look back on this moment and compare statistically, but I really do think the difference right now, what we're seeing is that people are just fed up and they're at a point where they're talking about it. And I really think it's a result of what happened last fall. There was just this explosion of people sharing their stories, whether it was on Parliament Hill, campus, the military, the media. People just said enough is enough. And I think that's what we're seeing now is a trickling effect from that massive explosion of dialogue last fall.
Julie, was there a trigger in particular that you can recall that you think led to more and more people coming forward?
CBC's Jian Ghomeshi story, I still to this day, looking back on it, have no idea what it was about that story that just cracked the shell open, but everyone I know who works in the sector will tell you that that story was a watershed moment for the folks on the ground who work in sexual assault centers. We saw an increase to calls to support lines. We saw unprecedented media coverage, and the word rape culture was sort of in the mainstream. It was part of people's lexicon. Whether or not they agreed that it existed or not, people were talking about it, and that's unprecedented.
And do you want to go so far as to say that, and we're not making any comments on the charges that he's facing right now, but in a weird way, Ghomeshi may have made a positive contribution to this issue because it was the trigger that allowed others to come forward.
Well, I've actually written about this. Yes, there's a definite irony in the fact that this man who presented himself as a very enlightened feminist on air, someone people trusted, particularly women who invited them into their homes and cars daily. In fact, there was a trigger moment where what the charges against him, I think, were so there's a shock. And I think the fact that there were so many women and that it required so many women to be taken seriously resonated really widely. So yes, I do think that there was, and it was also summoned the Yes All Women hashtag. It went crazy on social media.
Oren, we are in the year 2015. We are not 50 years ago. You might have expected that this wouldn't be an issue anymore. Why is it still?
Well, I disagree. I would have still expected it because I have a different perception of people. My standard's not that high. I work with very many people in different capacities. And I think the reason it's still around with us is that there's been no huge impetus for people to change. We're social animals. So if in certain contexts this is the norm, if there's no negative repercussions, now we're seeing the repercussions, but it takes time for it to finally sink in that this is something we shouldn't do. We would like to think as enlightened beings we wouldn't need these reminders, but the reality is that people will do what they want to do. They'll seek pleasure. They will just act with impunity if there's no negative consequence. And it's been a long time that there have been few tangible consequences.
You, Peggy, are a fun guest to have on programs like this because you tend to take, as you do in your column, a contrarian view to a lot of things. Do you want to present that view here today, or where are you on this?
Yes, I will.
Yeah.
I'll say that the problem of sexual misconduct in society has been wildly overstated, especially if you look at the historical dimensions of the issue. And anyone who's been around for the past 20 years or so, or 30 years, will tell you that sexual misconduct and harassment in almost all workplaces is a dramatically different situation than it was 30 or 40 years ago. Of course, we haven't eradicated the problem entirely, but the vast majority of men would never consider the kind of behavior that was fairly routine 30 or 40 years ago, either in the workplace or on campus. And so we've developed a kind of a moral panic around this issue, which is simply unwarranted by the facts on the ground.
And you've researched this? What do you think?
I disagree. I think that I don't disagree with the fact that tolerances are far different than they were 30 years ago. Absolutely, that has changed. However, I think what we're seeing now, because social media was not around 30 years ago, I'm not, and this is where a very interesting area of gray. We are seeing a level of virulence. We see it in terms of the shout-outs against camera, women trying to do their work. We see it at Dalhousie. We've seen it's like a rock has been lifted. And I think that is basically what has created this new conversation about what are the limits and what are our new levels of tolerance. I don't think we're there yet. And I don't know whether it's been overstated or understated. What I see is enough to say change has to happen.
Julie, this is, I'm going to get personal with you here if you don't mind, because this is not an academic experience for you. This is something that you have experienced in your life. Share as much as you want to of your own personal experience on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting conversation for me because I've worked in this field for over 10 years. I have 2 degrees in gender studies, so I know this on an intimate level, but I've also experienced it personally. And the irony that I was invited last fall to give a talk and a training to all officer cadets at the Royal Military College of Canada on what is consent, what is sexual assault under the law, and what can you do as a bystander if you see something. And the fact that I was sexually harassed, both at the briefings and in having spoken out about it, speaks to the fact that we have a problem. And looking back on what happened to me last fall and the fallout since then, since I've come forward with my story, if it wasn't so problematic and if it wasn't so worrisome, it would be hilarious, right? Like, people have said to me, you can't write better satire than the fact that you're there to talk about what to do if you see someone being sexually harassed. And you were being sexually harassed, right? So I think, I do believe that, we have a problem. And whether it's worse today than it was 20 years ago, I think it's a really poor measurement to say that, we're not living in the Mad Men era, because we're not living in the Mad Men era because people stood up and said something.
All right, I think
it's important for us to continue speaking out.
I don't want to be lewd about this, Julie, but I do want our viewers to have a clearer understanding, if you are able to tell us, about what specifically you found when you did that lecturing at RMC.
So there's 2 things that are really important for people to understand about what happened at RMC. There's what I experienced personally, and then there's what I was a witness to. So what I experienced personally was open mocking. I was catcalled at one point walking up to the podium between briefings. One of the officer cadets looked me up and down as he was leaving and said, "I might have listened to you if you weren't a woman and a civilian." And variations of that, people openly laughing. For example, the first group, second slide, here's the legal definition of consent in Canada, and people burst out laughing. So that's the second part for me, which is I heard and observed some attitudes and behaviors about sexual violence and about women's roles and about their roles as bystanders that was very worrisome for me. When people say there's no such thing as a woman being too drunk to have sex with her, when people are arguing with me that, if you have too much to drink, you are enabling your own rape and that's not my problem, that's scary. And I think we need to talk about that. And that's what I observed, not to mention what I also experienced, which was just blatant disrespect. And as I said, I was there to talk about how to be an effective bystander, and I was catcalled walking up to the microphone. So it's real for me, and I saw it. But as I said, it's not just about me demanding an apology for how I was treated. It's also that there's a problem that we need to fix, and that's not just unique to RMC. I wish it was, truthfully.
Well,
I wish it was a problem unique to RMC, but it's not. It's every campus.
We're going to talk about another post-secondary institution where this happened, and Anne, you've got the story on Dalhousie. Fill us in on some of the background on that.
Okay, I'll try to keep it short. Last December, it came to light in the media that a 4th-year female dentistry student, a number of women had complained to administration when they discovered that there was a Facebook page called The Gentlemen of Dalhousie, class of 2015. And basically, this was a private setting Facebook page. And what was discovered was amid the other messages were a number of messages about targeting the female, directed at the female classmates. They involved comments about wanting to have hate sex, I'm being euphemistic, with these women. They talked about voting for who you'd like to have hate sex with. There was a lot of misogynistic, reductive language about women and their place in society. There was also talk about chloroforming patients, a drug of that they were about to administer in a few years, so in a few months rather. So what happened was there was a big outpouring about how Dalhousie handled this. They chose to basically allow the men to be part of a restorative justice process as part of sexual harassment. They didn't have the mechanisms to deal with it. It became a sort of a flashpoint on campus for a lot of other issues to do with misogyny, to do with homophobia, racism, all sorts of things. And it is still fermenting at the university. There was a big report. All the men have gone through restorative justice. They're all graduated. So that's where it stands.
As further evidence that you and Margaret Wente do not necessarily agree on this story, here's what Margaret wrote in the Globe and Mail. Here's what we've come to on campus today. If you make a stupid juvenile mistake, you can be utterly destroyed. If you're male, that is. Why did you draw that out as the lesson of this Dalhousie story?
Because that's just about the truth. I was astounded when 50,000 people signed a petition calling for these men to be expelled and their careers ended. They're in the last year of dental school. These are bright young men. According to the women,
bright?
Well, they're not that bright, but they're probably more or less assets to society, who have engaged in stupid, crude, juvenile locker room humor when they shouldn't have. However, they never exhibited in their conduct any kind of harassing behavior towards the women they actually worked with. The women themselves said that. And they said what they wanted was for the men to realize what they were doing was completely inappropriate and apologize. All of a sudden, we have a witch hunt that wants the careers of these men ended for good. What is that about? Talking about crude jokes about chloroforming women is so far from the actual idea that any of these people would chloroform their patients that it's unbelievable. People have lost their perspective.
What's a more
completely.
sensible punishment for these gentlemen in your view?
Well, about what they got in the end, I'm happy to say, which was a private process that did not publicize their names and destroy their careers, as so many young men's names and careers have been destroyed. And they went through a process that everybody was pretty happy with by the end. They will go on to be dentists. They will be much wiser. And I'm sure that most of them will be pretty good dentists.
So a few questions on that. Who was happy at the end with that situation, the restorative justice?
Well, apparently those involved were, because they said so.
Because they graduated.
And they graduated, as they should have.
You say that these men are assets to society, yet the views they hold about women who are half of their profession now, women who comprise half of the class, are absolutely not acceptable.
I would separate, I would make a distinction here between the views they hold about women when they are mouthing off in private, trying to oppress each other. Men in groups tend to behave badly, especially when they're talking about women. That is still true. It has always been true. We can try to correct that, we sure should, but that's what men in groups do. They try to impress each other. And their actual behavior and attitudes towards the women in their lives may be two very different
But what
things.
does it say about our society when impressing other men involves talking about basically raping women? When that is sort of a level of, sort of a threshold of...
Can I get Orrin to speak to that? That's a great question. Like, what is it about men that makes them think that saying degrading things about women to each other is cool?
Again, we're social animals, so if that's the norm that's being created, it's a machismo, it's a way of bonding. I'm not saying it's correct, but this is what they've grown up seeing. And most of the men in any of the cases we're talking about, whether it's Dalhousie or other cases, are not going to, they're not sociopaths. The vast majority of them will not go out and rape or sexually assault women. However, the vast majority of them do, the ones that have been caught, do hold these reprehensible attitudes. And as Margaret's saying, and when I do my assessments, this is what I'm looking for. I want to see, is there a connection between the words and their actions, or the potential for that? And
is there?
It all depends. We have to see if a person is truly contrite. Do they truly recognize that what they're saying or doing is not appropriate? And in any context, as Margaret's saying, what happens behind closed doors is quite different than what's in front of it. But hang on, the thing is, I work with many clients who, in their social life, everything looks great. I mean, these are really respectable families, high-power families, and behind closed doors, it's a horror show. So I understand that what I'm saying is, it doesn't necessarily mean there's always a horror show. Sometimes what goes on behind closed doors is simply gallows humor, for example, the gallows humor. And you see this with firefighters, with psychologists, with doctors, that we need this as a way to kind of just, de-stress, okay? And again, I'm not in any way...
But again, why would positive, constructive de-stressing involve degrading conduct towards other human beings?
And that's the problem. I am not advocating or supporting that in any way. What I'm saying is that was the culture that was created. And it's not a healthy culture.
But it wasn't, here's what I find interesting, is that it simply isn't a culture that was created. It's a culture that's entrenched. And I don't think it's happening behind closed doors. What happened at Dalhousie, when I talk about a rock being lifted, what I meant was that we saw, this particular study on restorative justice that just came out absolutely pillories the dentistry faculty for levels of misogyny, inappropriate behavior, failure of professional boundaries, rumors of inappropriate behaviors, etc. And it's filtered right into the profession. There is not a female head of a dentistry faculty in the country. There's not any women on the board of the National Dentistry Association. I mean, we see, and the kind of pernicious comments like that, maybe these are not sociopaths, but I think that it speaks to a larger attitudinal problem that manifests itself institutionally across the country.
Let me ask the flip side to that, Oren. Do women do this about men?
They do, and they really do. And I've spoken with many women who do say that they may not be as physical in their descriptions, but they are equally derogatory in many ways. Equally, again, I'm not sure. I'm trying to think of the female equivalent of machismo. Okay.
There's that one.
There's one. Okay. Well, there you go. But what we do see this type of inappropriate discussion among women themselves, and I've taken part of it. Like I've heard it happening, and I've heard very many women admit that they do this. But what you were describing, Anne, was and you're saying that that's a slippery slope. For some people, it might just be bonding. But in this case, and I said earlier that there are certain contexts where this is the norm, and it extends it goes beyond rape jokes. It's an institutional issue.
But I bet Peggy Wendy's going to say if women did it, the consequences wouldn't be nearly as significant as when men do it. Am I right?
Well, women tend not to make overtly sexual comments about men because we are wired a bit differently.
Wait,
that's not my experience. I see women making just different age groups.
Yes.
Let's just say that.
But I would just like to point out that men too can be victims of terrible female behavior, especially these days, especially in an era where these issues are so highly charged, and women will make allegations against men, especially on college campuses, that are untrue and will ruin these guys. And that also is something that we ought to be concerned about.
Julie, you want to weigh in on this?
I think statistically, what we know about false allegations of sexual assault, people are as likely to set their house on fire for insurance purposes as they are to make false allegations. And it's really unfortunate that we constantly get back to that point because it's really damaging to actually view it in that way. But I wanted to get back to the point about this idea that I'm only a part-time misogynist, which is really what it sort of breaks down to. I'm only a misogynist on Facebook. I'm only a misogynist when I'm partying with people. I just have a really hard time swallowing that as a valid reason for allowing the behavior. To say I'm only, which was the experience with what happened to Shauna Hunt, right? With the Hydro One employee losing his job and people saying, well, he was only being a misogynist at a soccer game. Well, I have a really hard time believing that you treat women wonderfully, except when you're at a soccer game.
We should just put a little, sorry, Julie, let's put a little context on this, because I imagine there aren't very many people who don't know what you just referred to. But in case there are, Shauna Hunt was a City TV reporter. She was doing a live hit outside a TFC soccer game, Toronto FC soccer game. Apparently, this is a thing. Apparently, it's a thing across North America when mostly female reporters are doing live hits on their broadcasts. Some, juvenile idiots come up to them and scream into their microphones, and obviously it's not editable out because it's live. They say something disgusting, which I'm not going to repeat here. But it's a phrase, and a lot of people do it. And again, Oren, I'm going to ask you, what compels somebody never mind in public, on live television, where there's a record of it, where you can be, investigated afterwards. What compels somebody to do that?
Sadly, for some people, it's human nature, and I say this as not for everybody, but the fact is, different parts of our brain are operating. The logical, the self-control, the part of the brain that would say, never do that, you're going to get caught, there's going to be a negative repercussion. That's not the first part of the brain that's being activated in those moments. These people are acting on impulse, they're following a trend. If this was 5 years ago, you wouldn't necessarily see these people doing it because it's not the norm. It's not giving them, in their mind, permission to act without thinking.
Is everybody capable of doing this?
I've said this many times. I think everybody is capable of tapping into their dark side or acting in ways that would shock them. If you ask them on paper, would you ever do this? Everyone would say no. But in the right context, most people are capable of doing some pretty bad things. But not everybody will go that far, and not everybody will display that kind of stupidity. And I would never say that I would hope that it wouldn't be the norm. I'm just saying that we shouldn't, I'm never surprised when I see smart people doing stupid things.
Okay, here's the next question then. Peggy, this guy who did this, I'm not going to say his name, but this guy did this. It later emerged he was an employee of Hydro One, which is, as we know, still a Crown corporation, and he got fired. So did the punishment fit the crime?
Darn right. Well, yes, it did. First of all, Hydro One had no choice, because if they hadn't fired him, everyone would have come down on them like a ton of bricks. If I were the CEO of Hydro One, I would have booted that guy out the door. I don't care about the legal repercussions. You don't want that guy working for your company, and everybody knows it.
Okay, well, explain this to me then. The guy from Hydro One deserves to get fired, but the dental students at Dalhousie don't deserve to get expelled?
Yes, I can argue that.
Okay.
The other reason is it's very good for the
No,
guy
no,
to
but
get...
how is that consistent?
Because they weren't acting in public, for one thing. Their behavior was private until it was exposed publicly. This guy, first of all, I'm sure there's alcohol involved. I am quite sure there is alcohol involved, as there often is with males acting stupidly, which is another factor. But there he is. He's done something in public, in front of the cameras. How stupid is that? That's unbelievably stupid. But the good outcome of all of this is that you can be sure that this kind of particular social party trick is going to die off very quickly as soon as these guys start getting punished for what they're doing.
Anne.
I agree that punishment is a great inhibitor, but going back to the Dalhousie example, certainly, okay, let's talk about the private Facebook page. First of all, it was on the internet. I think anybody with half a brain knows that anything you post online, on emails, etc., is pretty much at risk of going public. What is interesting is everyone defends this group on the basis that the Facebook page was private. But here's the problem. They knew what they were doing was inappropriate, as reflected in the back and forth when they were about to be exposed. Yet they continued to do it. And the fact that it was private was what made it more sensational and more destructive within the class, within the community itself, because these were women who believed that these men thought of them as equals, who respected them. And what it did was essentially expose the fact that that was not the case.
Julie, can I get your view on whether you think there's a significant difference between so-called private behavior in a private Facebook chat room, if that's the right expression, versus publicly doing this on live television and making a complete ass of yourself for everybody to see?
I actually don't see a distinction at all. I agree with Anne in that I live here in Ottawa, where the University of Ottawa had a similar scandal around a Facebook private post that was made last year around how a group of men from the student council made rape threats against the female president of the student union, and then argued that their rights to privacy was violated when it was exposed, right? So I don't think there's a difference between you threatening to rape someone in a joking or non-joking way on a Facebook group or doing it live on television. I think it speaks to the same motive, which is I think I have the right to dehumanize you. I think I have the right to be degrading towards you. And in the case of Shauna Hunt, when she approached him to say, why are you doing this? He got indignant with her, saying this isn't about you, when he had clearly yelled something at her live on television. And that's the attitude that I think is the root of all of this, which is, as the doctor said, this is about a behavior that is actively condoned by peer groups. And And that's the problem. If every time you said that kind of comment, the people around you looked at you like, what is wrong with you? There would be no incentive to continue. But people are going viral because they're getting the reaction they want. And that's what I, in my role as a public educator, is trying to change.
Peggy, I want to do a third example with you, and it's somewhere in the middle. It's not as private as the Facebook situation, or as private as they thought it was. It's certainly not as public as live television. It was the case in Ottawa of the comedian, female comedian, who was at a so-called private corporate function, but who was the recipient, as she started to do her stand-up routine, was the recipient of some pretty obvious sexual harassment and catcalls, and I think one of the guys said, you know, there's a 60-40 chance I'm going to have you in bed by the end of the night, that kind of thing.
That's right.
Okay, private corporate event. Where are you on that kind of thing?
Well, I'm in the middle. First of all, what was the guy thinking? And again, I'm pretty sure there was alcohol involved.
Seems to be the common denominator for a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So entirely inappropriate, especially since that very week the Shauna Hunt story had been in the news. So, you know, male idiocy behavior takes over again. However, I do have some sympathy with the point of view.
That's the comedian, incidentally. Jian
I do have
Grant
some
is
sympathy
her
with the
name.
point of view that Jian Grant? Jian Grant.
Yeah.
Jian Grant, the comedian.
Yeah.
She's a stand-up comic. She's been doing this for a long time. She should have some ability to handle that kind of situation. After all, that's what happens in stand-up comedy clubs. It gets pretty raw and rough.
So you're not saying,
and
you're
so,
not
you know,
justifying
I'm not,
it, but...
No, I'm just saying, you know, maybe that should be in her, you know, more thick-skinnedness or ability to counteract that should be in her repertoire, considering her line of work.
Julie, what do you think about that?
I could not disagree stronger, and the reason why is because so when I came forward about my experience at RMC, I actually got quite a bit of hate mail, including death threats. And one of the letters I received was someone saying, you know, if you're going to make a career out of talking about sexual harassment, you need to be prepared to endure being sexually harassed. And of course, you know, as a self-care method, everyone around me was like, well, it's a good thing you don't talk about the death penalty or homicide, because to be expecting, well, you're going to get murdered for the work you do. I mean, it's such an outrageous thing to say. And Jian Grant is a comedian who has said, there's a difference between, you know, someone who's annoying and heckling you at a club. Anyone of any gender who's a comedian has experienced that. But to use her words, it took on a rapey tone that made her very uncomfortable, and it crossed a boundary. And she has a right to set that boundary, and the people around her had a right to respect her decision to walk off the stage. And as I said, as someone who was told that what I experienced at RMC, I should have had it coming because I work in this line of work, or that I needed a thicker skin, I think is deeply offensive, because no one should be sexually harassed at work, regardless of what you do for a living, including if you're a sex worker. I'm a public educator on sexual assault, so I should expect to be sexually harassed by the people I'm training. That's unacceptable. And I think the same goes for Jian Grant.
Oren, let me, at the risk of asking you a question to which you're going to give me the same answer you've given me already, but let's try this anyway. You're at a corporate function. Chances are upper management, maybe even the boss, is there. What provokes somebody under those circumstances to think that it's okay to mouth off in a sexually harassing way at a female comedian with the guy or woman who signs your paycheck standing 10 feet away?
Well, I'm going to add what Margaret kept saying about the alcohol. We can never discount the effects of alcohol. It's not excusing it, but that is a factor, number one. Number two, I don't know the man personally, but maybe he's used to, in his capacity, whatever job he does, to being able to get away with certain types of behaviors. So he's kind of being conditioned to expect no consequence. And then three, in that moment, the excitement, the adrenaline, you know, as I said, that's a different part of the brain. That his judgment part is not there. It's more of the immediate reward. There's an excitation. There was the anticipation before saying it. When he said it, he thought there's going to be a payoff. All of that was what he was focusing on, rather than the part of the brain that says, show judgment. There's going to be consequence later. But most people in that case would not go to that degree if they hadn't had a history, most likely, of being able to get away with it, because they would, you know, there'd be part of the brain that's overriding, saying negative consequence, don't act. And I'm going to infer that he probably has acted with impunity in other capacities.
And?
That makes sense to me. I find it very interesting that we're having this conversation. There's in terms of, is it, what she should be capable of absorbing, which seems to be a theme in all of these cases. We talk about, women drinking too much and becoming raped. Well, there's a great saying, which was the difference between a drunk woman who's raped and a drunk woman who's raped is a rapist. The focus should be on the rapist, not on the woman. Yet we continue to, at Dalhousie, there was and I think, Margaret, you wrote about this, that the women, basically, these are grown women, they should be able to tolerate a bit of, sort of locker room humor, as you put it.
My point is not that they should just remain silent and do nothing. The point is that we should expect, I think it's right, to expect a certain amount of resilience from women when dealing with the ordinary day-to-day, stuff
but that
of life.
Should not be part
stuff
of ordinary day-to-day.
And what we have done is to elevate many aspects of ordinary day-to-day life and day-to-day human male-female encounters and bad dates to the level of trauma. And I think that is a terrible message to send to young women who are now believing that any bad thing that may happen to them, and believe me, you're not going to get through life without some bad things happening to you, greater or lesser, and no, of course, they should not happen and they should not be excused. However, we're telling women they can't cope, and they're victims.
No, we're not.
And they're being traumatized by things.
As opposed to telling men to smarten up?
Well,
No.
we should tell them, both messages are very, very important.
This isn't about women, as Julie pointed out at the outset, this isn't about women not being able to cope. It's about women saying, I am not putting up with this anymore. And I mean, what's interesting is we keep coming back to this sort of discussion and it's mired and so forth. But there's a great video that went out 2 years ago. David Morrison, head of the...
Perfect.
It's
Segue, clip.
Okay.
We got it standing by. I wanted to say, if you haven't seen the whole thing on YouTube, it's phenomenal. It's only about 3 minutes long. We're not going to play the whole thing here, but we are going to play a snippet. And since look, it was right next thing I was going to go to right here.
Know.
This is Australia's Army Chief, David Morrison, whose message could not be clearer. Roll the clip, please.
I have stated categorically many times that the Army has to be an inclusive organisation in which every soldier, man and woman, is able to reach their full potential and is encouraged to do so. Those who think that it is okay to behave in a way that demeans or exploits their colleagues have no place in this Army. Our service has been engaged in continuous operations since 1999 and in its longest war ever in Afghanistan. On all operations, female soldiers and officers have proven themselves worthy of the best traditions of the Australian Army. They are vital to us maintaining our capability now and into the future. If that does not suit you, then get out.
What was the fallout from that?
Well, the fallout in terms of people leaving, he booted people out of the Army who did exactly what the men at Dalhousie did.
But did he get any blowback from being that categorical about if you can't respect women in this man's army, get out of the Army?
No, he's been lionized. He's become a champion. He's now on the circuit talking about this issue.
Peggy, you okay with this?
I think it's marvelous. I think all organizations should adopt that message, and many of them have. Most of them have. Certainly, most of the ones that I am familiar with and know of have.
Do you think academic institutions should adhere to that model as well?
Well, yes, but I would not categorize the Dalhousie situation as as a rape culture or an assaultive culture or anything like it. What we have done is inflate behavior and inflate language and inflate incidents, so that we are trivializing, unfortunately, true situations of sexual misconduct, and that, I think, is a shame.
Do you think the implication would have been the same if the men had been talking about a specific racial group?
There is no equation there.
You don't see a corollary between the two?
No. We're talking about sexual banter, which is
They were
always
talking
been
about
around.
raping women. That's different than sexual banter. They're talking about chloroforming and basically
Essentially drugging
and having sex with women who are incapacitated, which is the textbook definition of rape.
Inappropriate locker room talk in private. Absolutely no evidence of misconduct with the actual women. they were working with, who testified that they liked these men and that they had never had any inappropriate encounters with them.
Julie, what did you think of that video from Australia?
Well, that video from Australia, I get chills every time I see it, and I do want to say that many members of the Canadian Armed Forces have sent me that video over the past few weeks since I came public with my story to say this is the standard we need in Canada, and that I get great comfort in that. But one of I think the most important parts of that clip is when he says the things that you walk past are the things that you accept, and those are the standards that you accept. And that's what we're seeing here. And I think that's, to me, the takeaway. That's the tool to make a difference, is what you choose to walk away from, what you choose to turn a blind eye to, is what you are actively condoning with your apathy and your silence. And so we need to put our foots down. If there's no consequences for behavior, people keep perpetrating them. And whether that's from someone making what you think is an innocuous rape joke, to someone making a racist comment, to someone actively assaulting someone, or seeing a woman who's intoxicated and putting a target on her back, we decide whether or not we actively accept that. And right now, I would tell you we are. And I see that, and I hear it. And we live in a culture in which a woman who's had too much to drink should expect to be sexually assaulted.
No.
Like, the
Okay, Julie.
consequences for drinking too much.
Just two minutes to go here.
But I think,
let's have Peggy get into this.
but I think that's what we're
turning up the
actively saying.
temperature.
Okay, go ahead, Peggy.
We're turning up the
No, we're
temperature.
not.
Where we're making you've just drawn an equivalency between private Facebook dirty talk and raping women while drunk as being acceptable. Hello. There is a difference
No,
there.
that's what I'm saying.
Yes.
Hello, in fact.
These distinctions are important. They do matter. And what I'm saying is that we should keep making those distinctions and not try to impose the death penalty for jaywalking.
If if boys are hardwired to be boys, I'm using the expression here, boys will be boys, can education in high school, in elementary school, do something about this in your view?
It certainly can, because nothing says that boys are maybe hardwired to be more aggressive. We may have certain behaviors and tendencies, but nothing says that we're wired to be rapists or to be misogynists. So I think education early on, from the right role models, not necessarily, I mean, teachers are part of it, but from your peers, which you're not going to get. It should be higher level people. For example, parents, athletes, musicians, the people that the kids look up to. They have to take an active role in telling them what is acceptable, what is good behavior, and so on. We have to, at the teacher's level, help inspire empathy. And I say beyond teachers, this is really a parent's job, because that's part of what allows people to do these behaviors, is when you dehumanize, when the target is just some anonymous person, when it's just some image, when it's not a real person, we're far more likely to say or maybe even do horrific things. Empathy building is important.
Julie, let me give you the last word here. We're down to our last 30 seconds. It's one thing to educate younger people to make the future better. How about if you're over 60 or 70 years old right now? Can you teach an old dog new tricks? I hate to use the expression that way, but there you go. What do you think?
Yes, you can. You absolutely can, and I want people to know that. I work as a public educator, and I work from everybody from 5-year-olds to 75-year-olds, and they're learning things. I have worked with older folks. I have worked with people in office settings who've been working there for 30 years talking about workplace sexual harassment, and they get it. Like, people are willing to change. We just have to decide what is the standard that we want for our workplace, for our campus, for our community. What's the standard? And we set the standard. We set it.
Our thanks to Julie Lalonde from the Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centres. Julie, merci beaucoup. Thanks for being on the program from the nation's capital. Ann Kingston was here from Maclean's Magazine, Margaret Wendy from the Globe and Mail, and Dr. Oren Amate, the psychologist here in Toronto. Appreciate it very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.